Welcome to the We Hack Purple podcast, where each episode we meet a new person who works in information security and they share all sorts of information with us, stories, laughs, jokes, uh, war stories, and stories where we're the hero. And this episode is sponsored by the Diana Initiative, a conference committed to helping all those who are underrepresented in information security, which is Monday, August 7th, in person in Vegas at the Westin. But you probably actually came here to hear about my guest as opposed to just the sponsor. And so I want to welcome Wolfgang Goerlich. Welcome.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be on.
I was wondering if you could give a little introduction to yourself, maybe?
Yeah, sure. So first off, I'm really excited to share a podcast with the Diane Initiative. Huge fan of their work, huge fan of that organization. It's fantastic. I am an advisory CISO these days. My background is in healthcare and financial services, where I led IT and IT security initiatives. Did consulting for many, many years. So in financial services, stood up one of the first DevOps teams. In that same time frame, started a local chapter of OWASP and CSA. Coming out of that, going into consulting, try to help people get their hands around securing code and securing processes. And now I talk and advise folks on what to do.
So Wolf and I met because we're both faculty members at IAN's research, and I have been slowly kind of trying to get different AppSecchi folks from the IAN's crew to come speak on the podcast. And so when Wolf said yes, this was awesome. And you were working at Duo, and
Yeah.
then Duo got acquired. Tell me a little bit about this.
Yeah, so we're working at a Duo Security. So I work with Wendy Nather and Dave Lewis, if you guys know them, Richard Archdeacon as well. And Cisco acquired us, I think it was 18. And so we've now been moved into Cisco proper, which is interesting because we get to look at a whole bunch of different products and different services. It's a much bigger scope.
I saw Dave at OWASP, B-Sides Ottawa in November of 2022. And he was telling me, Wendy said we really missed some branding opportunities because Duo plus Cisco, like we could have been Disco. We could have been.
We could have been Disco or Panic at the Cisco. It works. Whatever works.
Oh my gosh. I feel like you're on a dream team. It sounds so fun.
It is a really great team, and we get to get our hands into a lot of different things, which I love.
Okay, so I want to ask about some of that. So before the podcast, you and I were talking a little about, so security folks tend to focus on keeping the bad people out, but you were talking about what if we look at security beyond just vulnerabilities? Do you want to talk about that?
You're right. Yeah, because one of the things that is fun about my role these days is I get to ask questions and have the time to explore the answers that we don't oftentimes get. When we're in a firefighting mode, and I spent years and years in the firefighting mode, you don't have time to stop and go, hey, how could we architect these buildings so maybe they weren't all made of flammable wood, right? You're stuck in the mix. And you're like, what am I doing? So I asked the question coming out of OWASP, looking at some of the data, from the SAST and the DAST tools that show, and this broke my heart back in the day. Like we talked about SQL injection, we gave workshops in SQL injection, we preached it, we showed it, and then you look at the lines of SQL injection and new code, and it's like static. It's completely static. I'm like, are we even making a dent? I was doing some work in OAuth OIDC. I did some workshops for IANS and others, and I kept coming across the same problem. People who were instantiating JOTs, and they were basically using the timestamp as the what was supposed to be a very difficult to crack or guess key. And I'm like, why is that? And of course, we get stuck in these vulnerabilities. And so I started to ask myself the question, because you're working on this, other people are working on this. So I eventually it'll get solved. I started wondering what would happen if tomorrow Tanya has solved other vulnerabilities for us. There's no more software vulnerabilities. People are producing strong code. Everything is secure. And an interesting thought experiment led to an interesting observation. That is this. We spend so much time thinking about security as a SQL injection flaw. Whereas when you talk to people, they think of security as someone abused me on an app, or someone tracked me, or what do you mean I uploaded my metadata and now they know where my address is, right? The idea of security that we have versus the much broader world is at a completely different level, and oftentimes has nothing to do with vulnerabilities.
Yeah. So, um, you and I were also like we're slipping down the slope. We have so many topics we're going to talk about, but one of the things I think that we were mentioning was like legitimate users that misuse features.
Yeah,
That's not an SQL injection, right? That's
right.
someone that's using your product, but not how you intended it at all. How can we identify that sort of thing?
Yeah, and it's again, it's not something we think about, right? Who is our adversary? And it's probably a hacker stereotype that we've all gotten off of Mr. Robot, or if you're my age, off the movie Hackers and Sneakers. And yet, if you think about if the vulnerabilities are patched and you start elevating it, oftentimes the attacks on security, personal security,
Mhm.
don't come from that stereotype. It comes from a loved one. It comes from a friend. It comes from someone who's spying on you. It comes from any number of different ways. One of the things I thought was really intriguing was having this in my mindset. I was talking to a company, an MSP, and they're rolling out this new feature. And they're like, this is great. So if you need support, the support technicians can turn on your camera and your microphone and they can interact with you. I said, oh, okay. So who are these people? That that usually like college kids who are hiring because it's front level and they can just interact. I'm like, all right. So you're gonna have a whole bunch of college people, not to be stereotypical, but probably 70% men, 30% women, most likely.
Mhm.
And you're going to give them the ability to turn on cameras and microphones. Yeah. You don't think that might be that might be a problem? Who's their user base, right? And what does their user base look like? And as we talked to, he's like, "Oh no, I got to put up buttons and I got to have an approval process and everything." Like, good, but that was something that he hadn't thought of, and it makes perfect sense because you're thinking about what if the criminals get in. You're not thinking about what if regular users have needs that are inappropriate and take those out on other users.
Yeah, I went to AppSec Cali, an OWASP conference, and a whole bunch of us were kind of sitting around having a drink after the day was over. And one of them said, "Oh, I'm having so much trouble with the security incident." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" And he's like, "Well, I run this little startup with my four other friends, and it does events for a community that we're a part of. And someone's complaining that you don't have to log in, but you can put someone's email address in, and then you can see all of our events that they're going to." And
Yeah.
I said, "Oh my gosh, yeah, obviously that's problematic." And the guy I was talking to was a 6'2" giant man who is Caucasian. And he's like, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, like lots of women have had partners like stalk them, and some men have this problem too. And so if they know I'm part of this community and I tend to like chat about things I'm into, right? So they would know, and then they would put my email address in, and then they could see where I'm physically going to be." And he was super horrified. And I was like, this is one of the legit reasons that diversity actually truly matters. Like, yes, we should be fair and we should get everyone a chance to have an awesome work and job life experience, but also we just can't get all those angles. And he's like, "Well, our team is diverse because I'm gay." And I was like, sure, that's one potential angle of diversity, but there's so many. And I'm like, "Have you ever been a 5'2" woman?" And he's like, "Well, no." I'm like, "You're a giant man. Who's going to give you a hard time unless they're like looking to get beat up?" I wouldn't get, you know what I mean? And so because he's this giant, huge, tall, strong man, it never occurred to him that this could be a concern. And so you and I were talking about the Apple tags. For people that don't know about that fund, could you give like a little overview about some of the things?
Yeah, so Apple Tags is fantastic, right? I can put a tag on my luggage, and I travel a lot, and the airline will lose my luggage, and I can find it again. Or more likely, I walk from my study downstairs and completely forget where I put my
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 phone.
case, right? Or my phone, and I can find that again. That makes perfect sense. It's a really good feature. However, when they rush this out, or I shouldn't say when they rush this out, when they put this out, I don't want to give any indication this was rushed. That's not what I'm saying. When Apple deployed Apple Tags,
Mhm.
no one thought about what happens when you put an Apple Tag in someone else's device or someone else's car. And it was funny. I was talking with one of my kids, and I said, well, because I got asked recently, like, should you be afraid of QR codes? Like, no, you shouldn't be afraid of QR codes. The internet's made for clicking. Your phone should protect yourself. And, phones like Apple have really good anti-tracking features about websites. And my kid overheard me. And afterwards, he's like, yeah, that all sounds great. But look what they did with Apple Tags. And what's fascinating about that is A, it wasn't thought about, right?
Mhm.
B, it's not malicious code. It's operating as intended. And C, just that small mistake has changed the perception of the entire company, at least in the sample size of one, which is my kid. So
Yeah.
these things can really not only have effects, downstream effects on personal security and whatnot, but also can have some really meaningful ramifications on the perception of a company.
Yeah. I I remember I went on a date with someone in a coffee shop like 4 blocks from where I lived, and when the date was over, the person said, "Oh, well, I'll just walk you home." And I'm like, "Don't worry, I know the way," which is my polite way of saying no. And the person kept insisting because they wanted more from the date than I was planning. But we're being polite, and they're like, "Well, it's late at night, blah, blah, blah." I'm like, I've lived here a long time. I'm fine, trust me. And as the insistence grew more, I said, "I don't want you to know where I live." And just
Yes.
like someone putting an Apple tag on you when you're in a bar and then you drive home and then they know you're home and you're alone. And
Right.
and when I said that, the person was like, "Oh my gosh, no, oh my gosh." I was trying to be chivalrous. I was trying to be polite. And then I turned into a creep. Oh my gosh, I'm creepy. I am so sorry. I'm gonna turn around now. And the person I think was looking for a goodnight kiss and not, I'm gonna stalk you and figure out where you live and be weird. But because it doesn't even occur to those people, all sorts of types of people are engineers and design these things. And threat modeling, threat modeling could have figured this out. And you and I, so this is like not really necessarily a cybersecurity problem. It's more like a privacy problem. And
It it definitely could be, but I want to stick on the security side for just a moment if I can.
yeah,
Because of course we've talked about Apple tags and some of the personal security there. What I would really encourage people who are building apps and thinking about cybersecurity is to think about security beyond just the vulnerabilities and think about basically the whole Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? There's multiple levels of security you need there. And we see it not only in things like Apple tags, we see it in banks. One of the fun things is one of the banks that I'm on, I can log in with my wife's password and my multi-factor because the way that multiple accounts are set up, it doesn't differentiate. Now, maybe that's not a problem because it's a joint account, but maybe it becomes a problem when someone's trying to deprive you of freedom of your money. We see this in so many different things. Phishing, which is not even a vulnerability, but how often have we seen people leave folks with such a sense of violation and
yeah,
really attack some of their underlying feelings of safety and security in their employment, so that we can say, look, we got them to click. Awesome. Now we can prove that.
yeah,
Right. There's just I think we broaden the definition of security to think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that entire area. We can
mhm,
really find some intriguing ways to provide better experience and cut some of these things off.
yeah, yeah. So I'm writing my next book, and I just wrote a section on privacy. And I know this is also something that's super important to you and probably our listeners and viewers. And in the book, I was trying to give a definition of privacy, and privacy is not only, the right to keep your information private, but it's also the right to not be interrupted and to
Yes.
have the ability to go do the things you want without everyone knowing about it. Like if you want to go get an abortion in Canada, that is legal. But if there's hundreds of people standing outside screaming and throwing eggs at you, can you really have the privacy to? And what if they take a picture of you and put it on the internet? And it's like, hey, this is like a private health decision that a person may have decided to make. And so when you and I were talking about this, like threat modeling privacy, or should privacy be part of threat modeling, like one of the many things, like when we do stride and we look through and we're like, could this be tampered with, are we sure we could figure out who did this or who didn't do it for repudiation? Where's the P?
Yeah, I think the security side of threat modeling gets improved if we include personas
Mhm.
that may have malicious intent with good features,
Mhm.
right? Which oftentimes we don't do. We don't move beyond that hacker persona. But I think you're right. There many people argue this. Their privacy isn't security, that's related, but it's separate. I took a really great workshop last summer by a person called Cara Bloom, and one of the things that got me there was oftentimes we threat model what happens when a bad guy does something good to our or bad to our software. We don't necessarily threat model when a company does something with the data they've collected. And so Cara put this workshop to explore that. And she has been working on a framework to help people. It's called Panoptic, which is Pattern and Action Nomenclature of Privacy Threats and Context. That is a real hard thing to say. But if you're familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, they're
Yeah.
using that same MITRE model, because this is also put on MITRE, same model as the attack framework to look at privacy risks and allow you to look at other breaches and model it and then play it forward to say, what if this happened in our app, in our environment, in our organization?
I need to meet this Cara person, Cara Bloom. So if you're listening or watching, I'm going to have a link to all of these things in the show notes. So it'll be wehackpurple.com/podcast/ and then it'll be the number of this episode, which I believe is 66. Your number 66. That's awesome. I briefly want to thank our sponsor again, the Diana Initiative, which will be this summer in August in Vegas. So so back to us talking about privacy. So one of the things I said in my book, so I live just outside Victoria, BC in Canada, and our
Okay.
most famous tech company is Cambridge Analytica.
Oh no.
Yeah. And so, and our biggest industry is tech on the island that I live on. So it's like, oh no. But that aside, you and I were talking about, we do least privilege. Why can't we do least data? Can you explain that a bit?
Yeah. So one of the reasons we do least privilege, and I continue to do a lot of work in the space of like privileged access management and trusted access to resources. So why do we do least privilege? We do least privilege because we don't know what a person may do negatively. So we want to close that boundary and only give them the data that they just need to do their job. All right, great. However, that still means all that data is there. So if the access controls get circumvented, if the account controls break, if any number of things happen, the data is still there. What would happen if we did least data collection? So
Mhm.
rather than control it at the privilege level, control it at the data level. And this is things that privacy officers have been talking about for many, many years, right? If I need to know, if I'm going to do a survey by my users by province or state, I don't need their street address.
Yeah.
If I'm going to do data analysis by age range, I don't
Mhm.
need their exact birth date. There's a lot of data that we collect that probably we don't need.
Yes. And you can't lose the data or spill it or have it stolen from you if you didn't have the data in the first place, if you didn't collect it.
Exactly. Now, The other thing about that is toxic combinations, right? Is that something you guys are covering in your book?
It is. It's definitely something that I dealt with a lot in the Canadian government. So it's like this is not sensitive, but when you add this and this to it, and it's all for the same person, it's now personally identifiable data, or it becomes, from protected A to protected B because, this could result in someone being harmed. And so I would have to look at these calculations when I did pen testing and say, oh, you've passed the threshold, buddy. We need some encryption now.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's what I think about a lot, because we take all this data, which in and of itself we probably shouldn't have collected, but maybe we'll need it one day. And then we throw it on a data lake
Maybe
where it
we'll
all
sell
gets,
it.
yeah, and then we'll sell it, right? Oh, which
Mhm.
brings up now I feel like I'm interviewing you on your podcast. But here's a question that came up recently. I was talking with a whole bunch of security people.
Mhm.
I was having this conversation, and one of the people asked, and I think this is a good question, like, well, Wolf, what happens whenever I bring this up is it gets shut down because businesses make revenue off of this. And one of the hardest places for a security professional to be in is between the business and the revenue. So she's like, well, how do you handle that? And I didn't have a good answer for her.
I usually so I do a few things. So some of the things I'll do is I'll try to explain the risk. So sometimes the data is quite sensitive. So I did counterterrorism stuff for a while, and then I had a lot of nightmares, and then I moved on to a new job because I was like, I shouldn't have to have therapy to have my job. And I am really, just to be clear, I'm really happy other people can and do those jobs because I can't. Couldn't. After a year, I was like, I'm going to fall apart. And so I have a lot of respect for people that work in that area, but I am not one of them. That's okay. But sometimes the data that you are collecting is quite sensitive. And I remember I was working somewhere as a consultant,
Mhm.
and they were planning to collect a bunch of information and then, in my opinion, do something that I felt was quite unethical with it. And they were collecting this from members of the public. And obviously, I'm not going to name the company. And I was invited for some other reason. And so I sent them a threat model after. I wrote a threat model and I said,
Mhm.
listen, if it comes to light, not only that you collected this data, because it was without, they're doing scraping of all these public things, and then, yeah, I can't get into more. Then they're doing something with it. And I was like, if it came to light that you were doing these things with this information, I think your company would go out of business because of the harm to your reputation.
Yeah.
Because, like, my personal feelings about how you're disgusting aside, it's that reaction that the public would have. And the people you're collecting this information on, I think they would be quite furious, and they would therefore, like, in my, if you're in Canada, we have the privacy commissioner. You can literally just send them a privacy complaint and they'll do stuff. Not always useful stuff. I sent a privacy complaint once and they said, did they say sorry for accidentally leaking your medical information? And I said, yes. And they're like, well, they said sorry. So, Canada. It's so true. They literally said, well, did they apologize? I'm like, yes, they did. And they're like, well, then, what more can you ask? I'm like, oh, but me sending them that threat model, I remember the one person wrote me back and said, like, we're not paying you to write a threat model. Like, they wanted me to secure their apps. And they wanted me to secure the app that they were doing it with. But I was like, I'm telling you, this is a catastrophic risk
Yeah.
to your business. And I would not be doing my job fully if I didn't tell you. And then that dude got fired. They canceled the entire thing. And they're like, cool, thanks for that threat model. And it was done. And they just stopped and they deleted all the data.
Good.
Um, but literally, I felt it was like, you will not survive this if this gets out. If you feel embarrassed about what you're doing, maybe you shouldn't do it and then put it on the internet. And so I try to explain the risk. And then also, so bringing it back to, again, a thing you and I talked about yesterday is the idea of nudge economics. And so
Right.
in these it's like 2 pages that I wrote about privacy, but I was really excited about it. I talked about, so you're a software developer and it is not your job to control everything at the business. And I'm not saying you should, if they're collecting data, you don't agree with it, you should walk out of the building and then burn it down and don't commit arson. But you can say something in the meeting, say like, are you sure our users would be comfortable with this? what if users object? Kind of makes me feel queasy.
Right.
Like, someone, because someone's going to read the terms of service, and someone's going to read this, like, what do we think will happen? And by asking that question out loud in a meeting, you can change the entire trajectory of a project. And I think that you had some thoughts on nudge economics as well.
I do. And I want to stick with what you just said, though, because how often have we all been in a meeting where someone's presenting and everyone's nodding and nodding and nodding and nodding? And then you raise your hand and you're like, um, I don't get that. Or are you sure you want to do that? Can we pause for just a minute? And all of a sudden everyone admits like, oh, I was worried about that too, or I didn't get it too. Right. There's oftentimes everyone nods along because everyone thinks that they're the only one who has a concern or they're the only one who has some confusion. So I absolutely agree about speaking up. With Nudge, I've been doing a series on design security using behavioral economics for 2 years now. I think the security principles are available on my blog if anyone wants to see them, and I pull out different things like the history of the toaster. What does that tell you about how to build a sock, or the way that the first laptop was created? How does that tell you about your UI UX? Things like that. And I do think this idea of smart defaults and
Mhm.
still providing choice, still
Mhm.
providing agency, but having smart defaults that allows people to be more cognizant of what's going on is
Mhm.
critical. The your example about data and clinics reminds me of the FTC. The FTC sued a data broker, the Federal Trade Commission in the US, sued a data broker in August because anyone with a few $100s and an Amazon account could get a trial version of their data, which tracked mobile devices across a whole bunch of different locations for marketing purposes. And you say, I want to know everyone who went here. And could be a clinic for healthcare, could be a number of things, and suddenly you have all that. Now, A, principal lease data collection, why is that all being collected? I know why, they're selling it. B, though, smart defaults. Why wasn't there smarter defaults to say, you can't see everything sensitive if you paid us a couple $100 to have an Amazon account, right? There's a whole wealth of ways to start peeling that back and making better decisions. But at the end of the day, when it comes to good security, we talked about Apple tags, we talked about privacy, metadata on photos is my other example. How often have we heard the common thing? Well, you should never have metadata enabled in your photos. That all right? Whoever came up with metadata, why didn't they just think about that and prevent or put in place good controls? Why is it constantly on the individual to have
Yeah.
their personal safety and security challenged because of the decisions we make in technology?
Wolf, this is a thing I've been talking about for a long time, and security people tend to get pretty ticked off with me when I say it. I'm like, "Oh, we're failing. We're doing a terrible job." And they're like, "What are you talking about, Tanya?" I'm like, "We're doing a terrible job." When I go drive, so I had to learn to drive my car. I know every so often I'm supposed to have my oil changed. I try to, make sure I have windshield washer fluid and stuff, but then I'm allowed to drive my car. But when I get into a car accident, the airbag just happened. They're not
Yeah,
like, "Oh, well, you didn't install that airbag correctly, or you didn't run this update, so now you get no airbag and you should have known." I
right.
feel like they expect the end user to know so much, and it's completely unreasonable.
I agree. I agree. I think there's when I look at nudge, one of the key things that I took away from nudge theory was empathy first, right? Empathy first in design. And you'll see that in like IDEO, right? It starts with empathy first when you design thinking, but that idea of how can we make it smart and safe by default and easy
Mhm.
for people to understand is something that we tend to really forget when it comes to cybersecurity.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, when I switched from software development to cybersecurity, this might sound really odd, but I had to work really hard on my soft skills.
Mm. Yeah.
So I was a software developer, and then I moved into management, and then I moved back down to software development because I did not enjoy being a manager in the Canadian Public Service. And then I switched into into cyber, and I had to learn a lot of how to listen uh, in a way where they'll tell me the things. Like sometimes you just need to be very quiet and just wait for the person,
Yeah.
or maybe you need to ask the right questions, or maybe this might sound odd, but I'll even change my tone of voice. Like if someone's speaking to me and they're being quite loud and I'll make my voice match theirs, because then I'll get a better response from them and I'll make them more comfortable, and then I can actually get my job done. And I feel like a lot of us could use some help in that area for being more empathetic, or being able to just shut up sometimes.
Yeah, listen, so kindness is the first principle of security, then listening is the second principle, right?
I
And
would like that. I would like that very much. I feel like I could talk to you all day, and I know I'm not allowed to. They've told me that 5-hour podcast episodes are unpopular, but I am allowed to invite you back. So before I completely wrap up, so people are going to want more Wolf. So you have a podcast, you have a book, you have a conference. Could you tell me about all of those things, please?
yeah, sure. So the design series I mentioned is at jwgoerlich.com. It's my personal blog I've been maintaining for over 2 decades now, which feels so long. My wife is a relationship therapist, and together we started a podcast last year to help people navigate some of those security decisions and to bring together her world and my world. So that's securingsexuality.com. That's where the podcast is. We're also doing a conference in Detroit. We got to get you to Detroit, Tanya. Come on to Detroit. We're doing a conference in Detroit where we're bringing together philosophers and therapists and hackers, and we're gonna have a great time. Everyone who like colors outside the lines is invited to speak to this. So that is in October. And yeah, to your point, she is a author, and her publisher got wind of all this, and now we're apparently on the hook for a book. So if that book will be coming out, I think, in 2025.
Okay. Yeah, my book's supposed to come out this year, but I think it's going to be early the following year because of me. Um, this is awesome. If you are listening or you are watching, but for some reason you're in a situation where you can't see the notes, don't worry. We Hack Purple has got you. So you can go to wehackpurple.com, go to the podcast section, and look for Wolf. His face will be there. He will look a lot like that. You can also just look for his name, and all of the notes and all the links for every single thing we talked about, Kara Bloom, and all of that will be in the show notes, because we want you to keep reading, keep listening, and learn more. And check out his podcast. It sounds really cool. I color outside the lines. I am into this. And so I want to thank the Diana Initiative one more time for sponsoring this podcast, and 5 more podcasts after this one. And Wolf, thank you so much for coming on. Please tell all the other IANS faculty members I'm a nice person. They should come on my podcast.
I will. Can I drop a Star Wars reference real quick?
Yeah.
This is episode 66, right?
Mm-hmm.
Said Order 66. When Order 66 was called, what did they do? They exploited all the relationships, and look at all the downfall that led to the Empire happened. And it wasn't a security vulnerability. It wasn't an unpatched piece of software. It was the people we trusted who turned against us.
Well, we have learned a lot of things from Star Wars, with Adam Shostak's book coming out in a few days, where threats, everything engineers will need to learn from Star Wars. And so, yeah. Oh my gosh, I'll link that in the notes too. That's awesome. Thank you so much for being on the show, Wolf. Everyone, please go check out all of his stuff. It's awesome.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, and let's wave goodbye. Thank you, We Hack Purplers.